All right. So I'll just start by saying a deep, heartfelt thank you to the organizers for putting me absolutely last, just before food. That's always a good idea, so I appreciate that. I want to talk to you today about the Secret Service and about the way the Secret Service protects the president and some lessons I think we can actually take away from that for the way we could protect data centers and protect organizations. And I want to start by telling you sort of a surprising fact, right? And the surprising fact is that anyone in this room, if they wanted to, could get on a plane, could fly to Washington, D.C., and could jump the fence at the White House. To be clear, I'm not condoning that or suggesting it. I'm merely saying it's possible, right? It's an iron wrought fence. It's not that tall. And if you were to jump the fence in the White House, you would land on the grass on the other side, and you'd have a brief moment of triumph, right? And I don't know whether you can see in the back corner there, but the next stage is about to ensue, right? And the next stage looks a lot like this. The most interesting part about this fact is, even though all of this is true, the White House is still the most secure public space in the world. And the Secret Service has built that, has sort of made this into the most secure space in the world, even though it's wildly public, even though it has fairly porous boundaries, because the Secret Service focuses on control, and they focus on rapid response. And what they're doing is they're exploiting a fundamental fact of defense, which is that when an intruder gets inside an environment that is controlled by the defender, the intruder is at a huge disadvantage because they have to move through that environment to reach a target. And if the defender is controlling that environment, then the intruder, each step they take can expose them. Each step they take risks exposing them. And so control is an incredibly powerful way to protect environments. And what's interesting about this is control is not prevention. One of the other statistics, and that's fascinating about the White House, is it's incredibly open. There's a massive amount of traffic through the White House every day, thousands of people, from school children going on tours to international dignitaries. And yet it's still an incredibly secure space. In cybersecurity, we've been trying to make the same transition for some time, right? The move from prevention to resilience. Our statistics in cybersecurity maybe aren't quite as good as the Secret Service's record. And I could include in here a long list, right? We could put OPM up, we could put DNC, we could put all these recent examples, but I'm going to simplify this down into one slide, which is 146, which is the average number of days that an intruder can spend concealed on a network after they break in right now. 146 days is a little bit under 5 months, which, I mean, I would challenge someone to spend 55 seconds inside the White House compound without getting caught. You got to run really fast around that lawn while they're chasing you, right? And so the core question of my inquiry is why? Why is it that the Secret Service is able to deploy this sort of control-based security, and we are making the same transition, or trying to make the same transition in the network, and we still face this challenge? So that's what I want to talk about. The Secret Service is a really interesting model for this, because the president is actually very like a high-value asset in the data center. Incredibly exposed, incredibly important, heavily targeted. But the Secret Service can't choose to reduce that exposure, right? The president is out speaking all the time. The Secret Service has to manage risk. And in the data center, actually, the high-value assets look a lot like that. The database that serves all the information we need, or the service that's running the application, these are only as valuable as they are connected. We don't get to isolate them and lock them away. We have to manage the risk. And the Secret Service does this by focusing on control. Control is sort of the foundation of their approach. And they have a 3-stage approach. Control, built on top of that is detection, built on top of that is response. And each of these stages work together. And I'll walk through a very simple example to sort of lay out how this works. And as we go, you'll see the interesting parallels between this and the data center. So let's imagine for a minute that the president is going to speak at an auditorium. And the Secret Service needs to protect the president. The first thing that happens is we think of security for the president, we think of agents in dark suits with sunglasses and guns and earpieces. But the truth is that security for the president starts months before the president ever shows up. The Secret Service shows up, gets a map of the location, and says, we know where the president is going to be. We know what our zones of control are inside this auditorium. And they map all the choke points in the auditorium, all the spaces that people need to pass through in order to move through the auditorium. And they map all of the paths between those choke points. What this shows them is all the attack vectors to get to the president, all the ways someone could reach the president and cause harm. And an auditorium is designed to be open, right? They're designed for freedom of movement, which means there are a lot of attack paths. So the Secret Service then says, what's the minimum number of paths that need to be open in order for this event to happen? And they close everything else. They radically transform the physical nature of the environment and move it from open to very closed. And to do this, they use things like barricades, like rope lines, they lock doors. They actually change the nature of this auditorium. And the power of this is a couple of things, right? There's a simple example here, which is, as an attacker now, I have a lot fewer options, right? But also, as a defender, I can easily see what matters. So the next thing that the Secret Service does is they deploy detection. These are things like metal detectors, video cameras, ID checks. And they don't just deploy them everywhere. If the Secret Service wanted to, they could put a metal detector at every seat. The problem is it wouldn't be terribly useful, because they'd get a lot of alerts, and most of them would be false positives. Lots of people would have watches on. Lots of people would have change in their pocket. And then in order to validate those alerts, they would have to send Secret Service agents out into the auditorium to respond, which means they need a lot of Secret Service agents. And it turns out the Secret Service agent is the most valuable and probably most expensive tool in the Secret Service's arsenal, because it turns out it takes a lot of work to train someone to do this. So a lot of what the Secret Service is focused on is minimizing the need for Secret Service agents and focusing them on the hardest problems. So they deploy detection in the places that it matters the most. Those paths that connect to the president, the entrance in and out of the auditorium. And that builds to, and they deploy it more generally as well around the entire environment, but they recognize, of course, that the more specific the detection, the more reliable the detection. The more general, the more likely it is to generate false positives. That moves us to response. These are things like agents, alarms, automatic locks. This is an attacker has showed up. What do? And one of the hallmarks of the Secret Service is rapid response. And part of the power here is control actually makes response quicker. So let me explain. The simplest example is an intruder appears at the edge of the environment and tries to get in. That's a great outcome, because they have to move really slowly, step by step, through all the checks that the Secret Service has put in place. And they probably get stopped. But it also helps if someone, let's say, is hiding in the auditorium 2 months in advance and pops up somewhere they're not supposed to be. And the reason is, the Secret Service has already shut down all of those paths and all those choke points. No one's supposed to be there, which means they don't need to stop and say, is this a false positive? What should I do? This may be someone malicious, it may not, but they don't need to ask that question. They can just react, which enables the Secret Service to react very quickly because of the control. And then last but not least, the hardest situation, you have an intruder who actually gets into the audience, who's sitting where they're supposed to be sitting, and then they do something suspicious. This is a really hard case. And what you need to solve this case is you need an agent to look at the person in the audience and to use their training to say, is this a problem or is it not? And what the Secret Service is doing is cleaving away as many of the other problems as possible and focusing the agents on this hardest problem. Take your most valuable tool, focus it at your hardest problem. You put all these things together and you get sort of this three-tiered approach. And what's interesting about this is control makes detection more effective because it's more reliable. And control makes response more effective because you can react faster. And so in effect, investing in control is more efficient than investing in reaction. That's why the Secret Service doesn't just send a bunch of agents out with the president. That's why they do all this work in advance. And so you can take away from this, right? Control is more efficient. Control helps you prioritize your problems so you can focus on the biggest threats. And control speeds detection and response. So we have this great model. And the question is, could we apply this to the data center? Would this work in our environments, and what could we learn from it? Because obviously the physical world is very different from the network world. At a simple level, you can say it's easy enough to actually map tools that we use in security onto these buckets. There are some surprising parallels. And you can see a set of tools at the base that are designed to actually control the environment. Control does not mean prevent, not keep people out, but limit and constrain movement through. But it's important here to have a dose of reality, right? Because this isn't how we protect our environments today, in many cases. Most environments are still pretty wide open once you get inside. If you take the stadium analogy, the auditorium analogy, it's sort of like someone comes up to you as a Secret Service agent and says, the president is speaking at an auditorium in an hour. I don't have a map. I've never been there and you don't have time to go. But my cousin Billy saw a play there 6 years ago. So why don't you talk to him for 15 minutes and kind of based on what he remembers, show up at the same time as the president and protect him? It's a little crazy, but often that's the sort of visibility and control we have in our environments. And what we've done as we move on this path from detection to resilience is we've chosen to compensate for this by focusing on detection. We say the network is incredibly changeable, it's incredibly hybrid, it's incredibly dynamic. We don't know what's going on in there. So we're going to focus on broad detection, and then we're going to use machine learning and analytics to filter through that detection and figure out the things that matter. The problem with that is it starts to sound a lot like the Secret Service putting metal detectors at every seat. On average, right, organizations, I think it's 80% of the alerts that get generated are false positives. And the average organization has the resources to analyze about 4% of the alerts they generate. You could solve this by hugely plussing up the number of analysts in your SOC, but it turns out that analysts are kind of like Secret Service agents. They're really expensive, and there aren't that many of them. What we need is a way to make this detection more reliable and to reduce this false positive rate so we can react to it faster. And this is actually what the Secret Service approach does, and that's why I think it's so interesting. So the question is, how would we do this? And the core of what the Secret Service is doing is building a relationship graph. And it turns out that there's a relationship graph in the data center as well. Here's a very simple data center, obviously a toy, but designed just for presentation, right? We have 2 environments. We have a couple of applications spread amongst the environments. If you dive in a little bit, you'll see that there are a couple of high-value assets. Think of these are the databases or the services running the application. And then there are a bunch of other servers. And these servers are effectively those choke points that the Secret Service was identifying. These are the pivot points that an attacker is going to use to move through the environment. And then you have a bunch of active communication paths. These are connections between these servers where data is being sent back and forth. And there's actually more than that. There are a whole bunch of communications paths, right? Because 2 servers in the same LAN segment, if a port is open, the other server is able to talk to it, whether or not it needs to talk to it. And so the question then is, right, the Secret Service approach works because what they're doing is radically reducing access to the president. And it turns out that going to see the president speak or going to the White House is a really burdensome affair. It takes a long time. You go through a bunch of checkpoints. You have to apply in advance. You have to get clearance. We're OK with that because protecting the president is the prime directive. But in an organization, the prime directive is making sure the organization works. And if your security approach makes that harder, it probably doesn't get implemented. So the core question here is, can we reduce this openness sufficiently to make it harder for the attacker without constraining the organization? And I would say the answer is yes, and here's why. This is actually an environment that we analyzed at Illumio. Super clear, right? Not that much going on. This is 600 workloads, medium-sized, right? Not that large. 1.2 million open pathways. It's a lot of open communications pathways. And as it turns out, most environments are open like this, or much more so. So one of the things I've been able to do since I've joined is analyze a number of environments. Here's a couple that I looked at. And these are fairly representative. One's fairly small, 100 workloads. One's substantially larger, 3,500. The interesting thing here is that for both of them in that pie chart, the percentage of those pathways in use is incredibly tiny, 3%, 0.8%. It's a very small number. And if you go back to the point I made before, right, all these devices in the same LAN segment are able to communicate with each other, whether or not they need to. It's actually not that surprising. So if you were the Secret Service, you would go in and you would shut this down. You would close 99% of those paths, 99.2% of those paths. And you would get this incredibly restricted environment, and only the necessary paths would function. And that would probably be constraining. But the key here is, to actually get a security benefit, you don't need to close 99% of them. If you closed 60% of them, you drastically reduce the options an attacker has to move through the environment. So we can go partway and actually get a decent chunk of the type of security benefit the Secret Service is getting without going all the way and completely constraining movement. So what would you do? Well, here's one way to think about it. We could look at this and we could say, what about all those open communications paths that aren't being used between development and production? Let's close those down. Why are they there? What about all those open communications paths that aren't being used between the 2 applications? Why are those there? What about all those open communications paths that aren't being used that are connecting to our high-value assets? Let's close those down. You haven't completely eliminated all unused open communications paths. We're preserving some flexibility. But what you've done is you've radically simplified the relationship graph you're dealing with. And what's great about this is just as it is for the Secret Service, you can start to see what matters. Right? What matters here? Well, those paths going from dev to prod seem a little strange. And all those paths connecting to my HVAs, my high-value assets, are probably important. And most important is that path that goes from development into production right to a high-value asset. What are these doing, right? And what you might do is you might now look and you might say, well, maybe development doesn't need to talk to production. You could examine these, and maybe you can shut them down. Simplify the problem even more because you don't need them. You obviously can't close all the communication to your HVAs. This was my point before. But just as an example, you actually can do exactly that sort of process. We worked with a large organization, had something like 100,000 servers, and we were able to find 20,000 or so connections between development into production. And then digging down into that, you could find several hundred that were actually encrypted. They were SSH connections, which raises a big question. Why are those there? That's doing exactly this process. By getting rid of some of the inactive communication pathways, you see the ones that matter, and then maybe you can tailor them. But you don't close everything. So we're in this detection stage, just like the Secret Service. And in detection, we put detection in the places where it matters the most, right? Which means we're going to prioritize any alert that gets generated from an edge that connects to our high-value assets. So we're making the alerts that we get a little bit more reliable. And we're sort of working on that signal-to-noise problem. Now, you're also going to do detection in other places, right? On your applications, between your developments, around the entire environment. But just like the Secret Service, you would recognize that the more generalized the detection, the more untrustworthy it is, the more likely there's a false positive. And so when you get detection from one of your focused points right around your high-value assets, you trust that more. It helps us focus on the things that matter. And that sets us up for response. In the response situation, there's the sort of happy situation, like with the Secret Service. The attacker lands in the development environment, which is probably most likely. And they move around through that environment trying to get to production. Doesn't mean they won't get there eventually. None of this security is impossible to break. There's no such thing as impossible to break security. But what it does do is it slows them down. Same thing with the Secret Service. It just means they have to make more moves. It gives you more chances to stop them. And if someone gets into production, the same thing with the Secret Service. They're in here. Chances are they're going to try to connect across a pathway that isn't normally used. And you can set up alerts to identify that. Again, you're making your detection more reliable, and you're reducing false positives. And if someone is smart enough to get into production and only use pathways that you use, they still have to go through the increased detection you've placed around your high-value assets, right? None of this makes it impossible for someone to cause a lot of damage, but it does make it harder. And that's the point. The thing about the Secret Service is they don't make it impossible. They just make it a lot harder. They play the odds into their favor. And this is a way to sort of apply that in the data center. So we have these three stages, right? And we're focusing down on control because it's more efficient and because it improves detection and improves response. So the last thought that I want to leave you with, also a lesson from the way the Secret Service works, which I sort of mentioned at the very beginning, is the difference between proactive and reactive security. Cybersecurity right now, a lot of it is very heavily reactive. There's been a big focus on the cyber kill chain and modern versions of the cyber kill chain that use different stages, right? Which tells security defenders there's a bunch of places we can stop attackers, and we should exploit all of them. And that's a very useful lesson. But it is also completely reactive. It's completely modeled around what is the attacker doing. And if you're in a situation where you can't counterattack, where you are always a defender, which is essentially the situation we're protecting environments, as soon as you hit a reactive stage, you're at a disadvantage. The attacker is moving first, and they're chipping away at the advantage you built during your proactive stage. We should still be doing reactive things, but we should also be thinking about what proactive steps can we take, steps that happen before the Secret Service, before the attacker ever gets on the environment, right? And in particular, what is the proactive part of that defense chain of what we're doing? Because that's where we're going to build up our advantage. This is not a silver bullet, and I wouldn't suggest that it is. But I would say, right, a couple of things you get out of this. Control is more efficient. It's a better investment. Control helps you prioritize, so it makes your detection more valuable. Control actually speeds up your detection and your response. It helps you react faster. So not only are you building a stronger advantage, but you also give the attacker less time to chip away at it. And then last but not least, it focuses you on proactive security, on building up that advantage. And all of these are ways that we can start to reduce this number, right? And we can sort of take back this maxim that when an attacker is inside an environment that the defender controls, the attacker is at a disadvantage. And that's the simplest way to change attackers that feel like this into attackers that feel like this. So that's all the time that I have, but I'm happy to take any questions.